In China, the will of the people has been thwarted by the will of the people's government.
In the history of communist China, there has never been anything like this.
There are still tanks in formation that have been resupplied recently.
One hospital doctor is now estimating that at least 500 people died in the bloodbath. He said, and I quote, "My government has gone insane."
In 1989, the streets overflowed with thousands of students and fellow protesters as they searched for political, economic, and social reform. The death of Hu Yaobang and the fall of the Chinese Communist Party damaged China's promising future. Swarms of students filled the streets of Beijing for over a month until the government detrimentally struck back. These violent pro-democracy protests sparked a revolution within China's future governmental change. Hu Yaobang was a cherished ruler among many citizens, and his political, social, and economic advances were a triumph for China. After his death, the tragic incidents of the Tiananmen Square massacre reserved many of his advances.
Hu Yaobang greatly impacted China as he sought for societal reform. Yaobang was born into an impoverished family and was required to work his way up in China's social class structure. As an early teen, he left his home and family and joined the communist movement, eventually becoming an office holder in the Chinese Communist Party. As a result of joining the movement, he was part of events such as the Long March and the Chinese Civil War, which had greatly affected society. This allowed him to build relationships and acquire connections that would later help him become the head of the Young Communist League. As time passed, Yaobang began to build up more of a reputation for himself. This allowed him to earn a spot on the political bureau as well as being named the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. This was his highest ranked position yet and allowed him to hold great influence over this uprising political party. He began to illustrate some democratic ideas and try to spark change in what he believed was an already corrupted society.
Mao Zedong was a key factor in the rising Chinese Communist Party in the years leading up to Yaobang. He sparked political and economic change in China and held a critical position in the country's resurgence. Though after his death, Yaobang gained power and began to disregard Zedong's beliefs. He saw Zedong's ideologies as inefficient and corrupt. This sparked controversy as uprising Maoists began to revolt against Yaobang and his drive for change. Though after some time, Yaobang successfully abolished most Maoist influence from the Chinese Communist Party. In his eyes, this was one of his greatest triumphs and would serve as a catalyst for future change in the Chinese Communist Party. Though his hopes for change were short-lived, in early 1987, the government forced Yaobang's resignation from the Chinese Communist Party, and now his only form of influence was through the Political Bureau. On April 15, 1989, Yaobang was rushed to the hospital and died of a heart attack. This ended Yaobang's pro-reform influence. Less than a week after his death, student-led protests began. This was just the beginning of one of the bloodiest protests in all of Chinese history.
On the day of Hu Yaobang's funeral, tens of thousands of students gathered in Tiananmen Square protesting for democratic and other reforms. Over the course of the next few weeks, students seeking political, social, and economic reforms gathered in the square. The government's initial response was to issue stern warnings, but they chose not to take any immediate action. This movement began to take place in a number of other Chinese cities. The government held an intense debate on what to do with the persisting protests from the mounting crowds. The martial law was declared in Beijing in the last 2 weeks of May, and the troops were stationed outside of the city. Protesters continued their movement in the city, which led the government at their last straw and ready to take action.
Thousands of combat troops from the People's Liberation Army now occupy Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The students are gone. The air reeks with the smell of gunpowder. A gray pall of smoke hangs over the square. Smoke from the barricades the students had hastily thrown up and then saw destroyed.
The Tiananmen Square incident began on the evening of June 3, 1989. Heavily armed troops were sent by the government to put an end to the multiplying protests and movements taking place. Troops were opening fire on or running over anyone who tried to block their way. They used full-sized army tanks and military weapons against the defenseless crowds. Unarmed citizens were shot by soldiers with AK-47s. However, the revolting students refused to back down. Bicycles were driven through the square hauling fresh corpses and injured students. The retaliating governmental forces were showing no mercy. The army denied access to ambulances and hospitals, leaving the victims to suffer a slow and painful death. The violence was not limited to strictly protesters. Innocent bystanders in the nearby areas were shot, including residents in their own homes. By morning, the square was cleared of protesters through shootings held throughout the day. The military had secured complete control on June 5th at the cost of thousands of lives. The Red Cross reported the death toll at about 2,600. However, they later changed the number to about 241 people after experiencing pressure from the government. The Chinese arrested thousands of dissidents, many of whom were sentencing with varying lengths of time, and some were even publicly executed.
As other countries began to learn about the incident, they immediately judged China for how they handled the situation.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
During the past few days, elements of the Chinese army have been brutally suppressing popular and peaceful demonstrations in China. There's been widespread and continuing violence, many casualties, and many deaths. And we deplore the decision to use force, and I now call on the Chinese leadership publicly, as I have in private channels, to avoid violence and to return to their previous policy of restraint. The demonstrators in Tiananmen Square were advocating basic human rights, including the freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association, because I happen to feel that this relationship is vital to the United States of America, and so is our adherence to democracy.
The Western media soon labeled this event as a massacre. The government tried to downplay the incident, labeling the protesters as counter-revolutionaries and minimizing the extent of the military's actions. Public commemoration of the incident was officially banned. Chinese officials created their own statistics about the casualties in order for the event not to be a huge deal. The cries for political, social, economic, and other reforms turned into a whisper after the government startled the society with their abrupt and devastating actions. Parents and family members of these victims simply wanted an apology. They wanted the government to admit their wrongdoings, though long awaited, but the apology was never received. Till this day, the government chooses to hide this event from the society. Not until citizens leave China will they be able to learn of the true severity of the explicit event. Many of the naive students never truly expected such strong retaliation from the savage government forces in this horrific tragedy. This event led to stricter future government policies, preventing a future massacre. The tragic incidents of the Tiananmen Square massacre reversed many of Hu Yaobang's advances.